Welcome to the Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine podcast for those that love to make and drink great beer. Before we start this episode, a quick reminder that at noon Eastern, 10 a.m. Mountain Time on Friday, October 23rd, we drop the special 2020 Best in Beer edition of the podcast to accompany the annual Best in Beer edition of the magazine. As always, magazine subscribers get to read it first, so if you're not a subscriber, go to beerandbrewing.com and hit the subscribe button to make sure you get this anticipated annual issue delivered right to your inbox as soon as it's available. Welcome to the Craft Beer and Brewing Podcast. I'm your host, co-founder and editorial director of Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine, Jamie Bogner. My guest on the podcast today is joining me from New York City, Kevin Stafford, head brewer, co-founder of Finback Brewing. Welcome to the podcast, Kevin.
Hey, Jamie. Thanks for having me.
We've had a lot of fun beers from Finback over the last few years at Craft Beer and Brewing. Thank you all for sending beers our way. Everything from hazy IPAs to fruited sour beers, mixed culture beers more frequently lately, and of course barrel aged stouts. And so we're going to talk about this kind of creative experimentation going on at Finback and some of the things that you all have learned on the brewing side through that process of experimentation. Looking forward to kind of picking your brain. And before we do that, nearly 2,000 breweries across the U.S., Canada, and Mexico partner with G&D chillers. Innovative modular designs and no proprietary parts propel G&D ahead as the premier choice for your glycol chilling needs. Breweries you recognize like Russian River, Ninkasi, Jack's Abbey, Samuel Adams, and more all trust G&D to chill the beer that you love. Call G&D Chillers to discuss your project today or reach out directly at gdchillers.com. Also, BSG is partnering with Leopold Brothers to bring a new line of small batch handmade malts to brewers and distillers. Leopold Brothers is a family-owned floor malting operation and distillery and 2020 James Beard Award finalist located in Denver, Colorado. Since brothers Scott and Todd Leopold first opened their doors in 1999, they've created everything from classic unfiltered lagers to a number of spirits, including a wide array of whiskey styles. Learn more about the upcoming malt line by going online to bsgcraftbrewing.com or contact BSG at 1-800-374-2739. So Kevin, talk to me about Finback as a brewery and also your brewing history, the arc that you took through this world of craft beer to get where you are today, co-founding Finback and getting into brewing in general.
Well, it all started, a long time ago. I got into home brewing, so I'm one of the guys who started off as a home brewer. Home brewed for about 9 years.
Wow.
Brewed everything, pastry stouts, IPAs, the whole spectrum. And after doing that for a while, I decided to get real serious about it, and I started looking for some brewery work. I got a job at Defiant Brewing in New York City, and I got another brewing job shortly after that, and then not too long after that, I decided to jump in it, and we found a space, bought a brew house, and put everything together.
What year was that?
2014.
2014
is that's when we made our first beer.
New York City has come a long ways over the last decade. I moved down to New York City in 2010, and when I left Long Island City, there were 3 or 4 breweries, maybe, in the entire city at that point. And then within a year of leaving, there were a couple more. And at this point, there's been a real renaissance in the world of craft brewing, even within the borders of New York City, in a way that I'd never really experienced prior to that. Manufacturing in New York City itself can be a real challenge. Talk to me about some of the interesting challenges that you faced with, getting an urban brewery in such a large, tightly packed, dense kind of city up and running.
Wow. Yeah. Well, I got to say, finding the right space was probably one of the hardest things to do. I was literally looking for a space for 2 solid years. And it was like a full-time job. Oftentimes I felt like I saw everything on the market. I started looking in close to where I live. I live in Park Slope, but I was looking for a space over in Gowanus and the Sunset Park neighborhood of Brooklyn. Um, and it was really hard to find a space that was affordable. And I slowly moved that search out and started looking further and further out. Started looking at spaces in Queens where we did finally find a space.
So talk to me a little bit about this challenge that you as a brewery face is locations that are near the people and near an audience or within walking distance of a neighborhood and have the potential to or easy to get to for people, because people in New York City, with some exceptions, generally speaking, don't drive cars. It's going to be subway, public transportation,
Uh-huh.
car service, cabs now.
Uh-huh.
And so when you start talking about buying beer, when I lived in the city, I mean, beer meant I might stop by the grocery store on my way home, after getting off the subway to grab something because we didn't have a lot of refrigerator space. We didn't store stuff for very long. It was very much a just-in-time inventory for my own personal stash. And that's a bit at odds with the way that people buy beer these days, especially now when people are buying cases of 16-ounce cans. How did you balance this, like being close to where people are so they can frequent the brewery versus finding something cost effective, so that you can afford to have a brewery there and then still figure out how to get beer to people in the kind of quantity that you need to?
Yeah, that sounds great. We chose a space that was pretty far from public transportation
Yeah.
and far from people in our kind of age range and the kind of people who buy, the kind of beer we make and drink. Um, so that was definitely a hurdle we had to get over. Um, but it just made us work that much harder to create a destination where people will, go that extra mile and come out and get the beer.
So when you launched the brewery, was there a defining idea behind what you're going to brew? There are some folks that start with a very clear idea of what the beer is going to be. For you, as you were envisioning Finback, what was the idea that drove it?
Initially, it was the whole idea behind what we wanted to do was experimentation, and we wanted to brew everything. We wanted when we first opened, we had kind of like a West Coast IPA, a wit beer, and a smoked porter. And that was kind of like the
Some
direction we
good
were
old
going in.
classic stuff, sure.
It's like, wit beers, you didn't really see that often, and there weren't that many smoked beers out there, and that's kind of the direction we wanted to go in, but that's not the direction that people wanted us to go in. So not too long after, we kind of changed our tune, and I mean, now we're pretty IPA heavy. I mean, even back then, 6.5 years ago, um, I totally would have jumped in and done all IPAs, but I didn't think that was possible. But now it clearly is very possible.
Sure,
So now
sure.
we're pretty IPA heavy.
How did you find what people wanted from you? I mean, I think that's always an interesting thing. When you launch a brewery, um, how, how do you get to a point where there are enough people that even know or care, what you're doing to even give you the feedback and say, hey, we think it's going to be would be more interesting if you do this kind of thing.
Yeah, so just doing events at bars and going to beer fest and stuff, just chatting with people, and people can be pretty straightforward, and they're not afraid to tell you how they really feel,
Right.
whether that's for good or bad. Um, yeah,
Well, rather they be honest than tell you just what they think you want to hear.
that's true.
So then over the last 5 or 6 years, I mean, we've watched actually, I mean, I guess it would be about 5 years, this kind of hazy, juicy IPA trend start to bubble up, in 2013, 2014.
Yeah.
And then, start to kind of hit a trotting speed around 2015, right as you all were kind of, coming up. How did that and this kind of emerging trend that was kind of interesting and becoming more captivating to to brewers and drinkers at the time. How were you able to kind of corral that and stake out some territory in it?
Yeah, for us, it was kind of a slow, steady pace. Um, the IPAs we were making when we first started out versus what we do now they're slightly different. I think before our IPAs were more kind of a West Coast style. I don't think they were 100% West Coast.
Yeah.
We'd use all the hops, and the IPAs we made, they weren't as bitter as you would think a West Coast IPA to be. I think the real difference was the yeast that we were using. Initially, we were using Chico yeast on all our IPAs,
Right.
and I'd compare them to all the hazy boys, and you know our beers stood up, and they were just great hoppy beers. But the minute I changed from American to London yeast, people went nuts. And I'm like, it's the same beer, you know? It's like,
Yeah.
yeah, so,
It was just
but
as simple as changing the yeast strain.
yeah, yeah, it was out of this world, the response.
That's kind of fascinating. So same hops, same process, same dry
Yeah,
hopping, everything, and all it was just a bit of a pivot on the yeast.
yeah, and like 30% more haze, and people were dying.
So as you started making that move, were there any additional kind of bodybuilders that you started moving towards, whether it's oats or wheat in the grist to kind of help push that haze along, or were you already doing that in your with your American or West Coast style
Yeah,
IPAs?
it's something we always did.
Yeah,
We always kept our bases very pale. Um, I always used Pilsner malt as a base.
yeah.
Um, I
Why?
always thought that two row was a little dark for me, but we always use Pilsner as a base, and then flaked oats and wheat,
Yeah.
sometimes together, sometimes separately.
Pale malt just too dark. Yeah, I
Yeah,
don't hear that
yeah,
very often. um, so in that sense, I mean, while that's one thing on a West Coast style IPA that can make for some incredibly, very, very, very light, kind of hazy, juicy IPAs, almost like pale and milky.
oh yeah.
Have you kind of kept it in that realm, or do you tweak it here and there?
There's an ebb and flow between like super pale, milky, beautiful, you know, just a light straw colored beer, and then
Yeah.
something more yellow.
Well, let's talk a little bit about hops in a second, but first, Five Star Chemicals and Supply is your leading provider of cleaning, sanitizing, and adjunct chemicals for breweries throughout North America and internationally. All products have been formulated with safety, equipment, material, and quality in mind. Interested in trying their products? Contact support at fivestarchemicals.com to inquire about a free craft brew sample pack and only pay the shipping. Just mentioned that you heard it here on the podcast. Cheers to beer. Also, Yakima Valley Hops is your hop source, whether you're brewing 5 gallons or 5 barrels. Get all the hops you want when you want them. They source the highest quality hops from the Yakima Valley and premium growing regions around the world so that you have access to the largest hop portfolio possible, even the hard to find varieties like Citra, Nelson Sauvin, and Galaxy. Homebrewers visit YakimaValleyHops.com and wholesalers visit SpotHops.com. So let's talk a little bit about hops in your IPAs. Obviously, you make a whole bunch of them, and
Yeah.
generally those prime drivers and differentiation between those IPAs become hops. Do you have some favorites, and are there some ways that you found to blend or to use those that create some interesting combinations or flavors that you find very appealing or that somehow feel more representative of Finback?
Yeah. Well, I have to say, I do love Citra and Mosaic,
Yeah,
but no,
that's
one of my new,
such a rare opinion.
yeah, yeah, but
No, there's nothing wrong with those.
yeah, no, they're great. I just had to give them a shout out, it's well deserved. I'm a big fan of Meridian hops.
Meridian, okay.
Yeah, if you do a single IPA with Meridian, you kind of get like a green melon flavor,
Hmm.
kind of like honeydew.
Yeah.
It's beautiful. Um, and Brew One is another one. Some pineapple notes.
Right.
I'm a big fan of all the experimental hops. It's like whatever's new, I gotta have it. I gotta get it. I gotta play with it.
Right.
So like yeah, so experimental 02596 or whatever, or HBC. Yeah. So all the new hops, I'm definitely interested in.
When you are thinking about hops combinations, what does that process of kind of creation look like for you? How do you, is this something in your, in your head, or do you rub and smell, or do you have a kind of taste or an end product or end kind of goal in mind, and then you build hops around it, or do you take a more, kind of developmental approach and see where the combinations take you?
Yeah, I don't think I have like an end goal for a particular flavor when I start mixing hops, but I do like to keep things kind of in harmony
Yeah.
and just kind of layer the flavors and aromas that I think will go together. An interesting combination, Mosaic and El Dorado, when kind of like dry hop together, they actually produce that same kind of green melon flavor that Meridian has.
Hmm.
And I think if I had a Meridian beer and a Mosaic El Dorado beer side by side, I wouldn't be able to tell the difference.
Interesting.
But so sometimes you find weird combinations like that. There was another beer we did. It was dry hopped with Citra and a Tannum.
Mm-hmm.
This was years ago, but it came out tasting like basil.
Interesting.
It was good, but
Yeah.
it was very unexpected. Very unexpected.
Huh. Um, have there been any of these unexpected finds that you've enjoyed so much that they've become things you've gone back to, or do you just continue to kind of push and try new things more often than that?
Yeah, for me, it's really hard to repeat a process and a combination just because there's so much out there. Um, so I tend not to repeat myself too much
Yeah.
just because I can't make myself do it. It's
Right.
like there's too much going on.
Yeah. What is at the same time, you are trying to learn from each one of these brews. How do you keep track of what you're learning through that process? Tasting notes, or, combination strategy, or process, kind of tweaks. Do you have some way of taking what you're learning so that you can pull back on that and reference it down the road for the next round of experimentation?
Oh, absolutely. Plenty of tasting notes, plenty of spreadsheets,
Yeah.
with as much information as possible, mash temps, grain, you know, water profiles, ratings on all the apps and
App
websites
ratings even figure into
to
that.
everything.
Yeah.
I want to know as
Yeah.
much information as possible. It's very important. So,
How do you manually pull that information and feed it into a
oh yeah,
spreadsheet?
absolutely.
Wow, really? How
Yeah.
often do you do that kind of thing? Just, is it weekly,
You know,
monthly, or?
it's more of like a monthly or bi-monthly.
Yeah.
I'll just sit down, knock it out, and then I have it.
Do you look at scores, or are you also looking at kind of tasting notes and what people are saying, and does time figure into that at all? Because I'm
Eh,
always
It's
curious about that.
it's mostly overall score
Yeah.
because yeah, time can have a factor, when people rate stuff.
Right.
Same thing with tasting notes. I try not to look at that. I try to get a quick kind of rating. I don't know.
It can also be slightly depressing as a brewer to read too many of people's comments.
Yeah, so you just flip through it real quick.
Yeah. But it is also, I think, an interesting way to kind of track how things are aging. And of course, you never know what kind of condition people are keeping anything in. And so
Oh,
it can be
absolutely.
hard to actually, pull actionable information out of some of that over time. But, in a kind of broadly descriptive ways. How have Untapped ratings impacted how you brew, or what you brew, or whether you pull back or bring back certain things? Does that really figure into it, or is it just another piece of the decision making puzzle?
No, I feel like that doesn't affect how we brew. I think more or less it's what the sales guy comes back to us with,
Yeah, yeah.
and how the actual people who buy the beer.
How is most of the Finback beer bought? Is it mostly brewery direct? Is it a mix of brewery direct and distributed beer, or draft and then cans out of the brewery? What does that mix generally look like?
Oh man, so right off the bat, it's about 50-50 cans to draft. We have one distributor we work with in New England. We self-distribute in the city. We do get a lot of people coming direct, but it's probably most of it is from retailers.
Yeah. So that then also creates another challenge, that breweries commonly face of trying to, when you selling it directly out of your tap room, it becomes easier to see what's moving quickly. And there are those breweries that are moving cases of beer out of their tap rooms here or there. And you get a very fast feedback loop as to how things are moving. There becomes another challenge to, I guess even your delivery drivers have to communicate directly with your accounts to see what, people are buying and how quickly they're buying it.
Uh,
Does that feedback loop then feedback into what you put into the mix?
Absolutely. I mean, again, the more information, the better. And, we respect everybody's opinion. And yeah, we definitely try to use that. I think that's kind of now we're kind of just focused on like, hazy IPAs, low alcohol to double IPA to triple IPA to, and then, pastry stouts, kettle sours, and mixed culture, funky sours.
What, from your perspective, how do those break down for you? Is IPA, 50%, 40%? It is the biggest share of most breweries' kinds of, output. How much, from a market standpoint, is there, a desire to drink those pastry stouts, or those kettle sours? Is it, evenly distributed, or, in a broad sense, what does that look like?
Yeah, so yeah, majority of the beer we make are IPAs, maybe
That's
like
no, yeah,
80% or
that's no
something.
surprise. That's everybody these days. Yeah.
Yeah, it might be more. It might be more, but yeah, we sprinkle in kettle sours.
Yeah.
I think we probably try to do one a month, sometimes every other month.
Yeah.
Maybe in the winter it's every other month. Um, and then non-barrel aged pastry stouts, we also try to get in there once a month.
Yeah. With those kinds of things, with these kettle sours, with, the pastry stout, dessert stout kind of approach,
Hmm.
what drives you on those? Is it this, do you do it because people want it from you? Is there a creative drive to try and create these things? I know that from a brewer perspective, there are plenty of mixed opinions about some of those beers, and some brewers love them, some brewers don't love them, some brewers make them because they have to, and other brewers make them because they're exciting beers to, and allow for some experimentation. Talk a little bit about your, the brewing philosophy that's driving some of those other product sectors.
I mean, I do feel like we do need to brew it. I don't think we're brewing them because we have to,
Yeah.
but I do like a kettle sour once in a while, and I like the fruit heavy kettle sours and the gozas, and there's just so much fruit out there. I love playing with, mixing fruit together and throwing them in a sour.
Yeah.
Um, one of my favorite sours we did. I don't know if we first brewed it last year or the year before, but it was a goza, super salty. I like my goza salty, so
Okay.
our gozas are generally saltier. But it was just a coconut goza, kind of inspired by coconut water. It kind of had like that. It was inspired by like the saline kind of flavor from coconut water and
Uh-huh.
obviously coconut, and it was stellar. Yeah, it was fantastic. And same thing with the pastry stouts. There's so many adjuncts that kind of work so well in an imperial stout. And I joke around all the time that I'm going to start making pastry pilsners, but we haven't done it yet. But it could happen.
Oh
it
man.
could happen.
You're
I
gonna
mean,
join Modest Brewing out of Minneapolis on that pastry pilsner front, huh?
oh
Yeah.
yeah,
Oh,
do they have some?
they've sent us a few of those. Yeah.
Oh, that's
Yeah.
great.
Um,
I'll have to talk to them.
there's yeah, for every hardcore tradition, there's an iconoclast who would love to go against the stream and show that something can be done. Now, I mean, all of your pastry pilsners pale in comparison to Bud Light Lime and the kind of scale that macro beer has achieved by putting
Sure.
adjuncts into lagers. And so the crime against lager that you might be able to consciously commit is still small, by comparison. But let's talk a little bit about adjunct ingredients, especially kind of in that pastry stout or dessert stout kind of realm. I want to kind of dig in. In fact, I'm going to open one of these here in a second. Before we do that, ABS Commercial is excited to be a part of today's podcast. ABS is a full brewery outfitter offering brew houses, tanks, keg washers, and small parts. ABS wanted to do something fun for the craft beer industry, so they're giving away an ABS Keg Viking keg washer live on December 5th, which happens to be National Repeal Day. To enter, go to www.abs-commercial.com, click on Keg Viking page, and fill out the contest form for your chance to win. Also, Craft Beer and Brewing's All Access subscriptions give you a year of the print and digital editions of the magazine, plus access to our library of video courses, a special deep dive email only for All Access subscribers, premium content, and All Access exclusive merchandise. Go to beerandbrewing.com and click on the subscribe button to join now. I'm going to open a bottle of Incarnation here, which is actually, I guess, a barrel-aged stout, but
Yes, it is.
because why not just open up a barrel-aged stout to drink while we're having a pleasant conversation about pastry pilsners and whatnot on the
Yeah,
podcast
nice
here.
little 13%.
Yeah, yeah. This one was a bottle that was left over from our review process for the last issue of Craft Beer and Brewing, and I believe it scored rather well. Congratulations! And
Thank you.
so let's
Thank you.
talk about this kind of dessert stout approach and mixing ingredients. Talk to me a little bit about where you find inspiration around this and what you draw on to kind of push new ingredient ideas. It does seem like the process of innovation is constantly moving here, and I'm just curious what you pull on to kind of come around with these flavor combinations.
Yeah, so I kind of look at the beer itself for kind of inspiration. And, you get that kind of rich body, a little roast and, caramel notes and just high alcohol from these stouts. And, I always want to use something initially that's kind of like harmonious with those flavors and that feeling. And, coffee and chocolate are such an easy one to go straight to. I mean, I think one of our first pastry stouts was a chocolate coffee stout. Um, and then just kind of based off that, it's like, what goes with coffee? Like maple goes with coffee, cinnamon goes with coffee, marshmallow goes with coffee. And you just kind of play around with that, and then it's just a rabbit hole of different ingredients. Peanut butter and vanilla, chilies and coconut. We use a ton of coconut, kind of across all our beers, but especially in imperial stouts.
What is it about
I just
coconut
love
in
coconut.
particular that you use, and how do you use it? I mean, there's a number of different ways to kind of move it into a beer. How do you find yourself using it more often than not?
So we've tried it a couple different ways. We've tried it in the boil, doesn't really work.
Yeah,
We've tried it in the mash, doesn't work. We've tried adding a little bit to the fermenter during fermentation. That was a long time ago, and we certainly didn't add enough. But now we add everything cold side.
yeah. Do you toast it? Do you put it in raw? What is it? What's
Uh,
that processing look like?
so yeah, we do raw.
Okay.
I think that's one thing a lot of other people don't do. A lot of people get toasted coconut, um, but I've I've used toasted coconut once. Again, I don't think I used as much as I should have, but I didn't get the same kind of flavor I got from the raw.
Yeah, and I mean, I've talked to plenty of brewers who do it both ways, and it's kind of fascinating to see. You can get depending on other fine points of process, you can get good results both ways. It's interesting that you do it that way. Now, talk to me a little bit about managing the kind of oil component in coconut, especially when you're using it raw. I mean, that is one reason that a lot of people toast it to kind of dry it out a little bit and not end up with head killing oil in their beer quite as much.
Yeah, I see. I just don't worry about
Yeah.
it. Like, I don't
Just
care.
don't worry. Yeah.
If there's a little oil in it and there's no head, I don't care. As long as the beer tastes good, that's the number one.
Yeah.
And number two is if that imperial stout coats the glass, kind of like, when you kind of rotate the glass a little bit,
Right.
like, as long as it sticks and it makes the glass brown and just stays there for a while, that makes me happy. I don't care if there's no head.
It's interesting that kind of oily sheen is the new lacing for this kind of imperial stout,
Right?
because
It's a
they
little oil slick.
because they don't really have head to speak of, but that kind of thick oily sheen that just kind of sits there on the glass becomes that thing. Um, let's talk about some like nuts or a similar kind of oily ingredient, and you do use those quite a bit, hazelnuts, peanuts, etc. What
Oh,
does your
yeah.
nut process look like in building these kinds of beers?
For peanut butter, we've been using
Yeah.
PB2, kind of like the powdered stuff. We've had pretty good results with that. We've just done like past 4 or 5 imperial stouts had PB2 in it. We've used almond and hazelnut.
Is that all going
Um,
in cold side then with PB2?
yeah, that's going on. Yeah, it's all cold side. Yeah, all the nuts go in cold side. And the thing about them is you just got to use a lot,
Yeah.
a lot. It's really sad. And it looks like you're wasting them, but
When you say a
it,
lot, what does a lot look like in terms of
oh
like
God.
pounds per barrel
Oh, I don't have the pounds per barrel off
or
the top of my
total
head.
volume for I don't know, you're brewing on 15 or 20 or 30? What?
Yeah, I have a 20, so we do 40 and 60 barrel batches. So, but yeah, I guess if we're going to do a stout, it'd probably be like a 20, or if it's coming out of barrels, it'd be even less than that.
Yeah.
But it's still hundreds of pounds.
Yeah.
It's
What does that extraction process look like? Now, I mean, naturally, if you're starting to talk about higher ABV beers in this kind of stout realm, the alcohol is going to aid the extraction a little bit. But you can also, as you're adding dried powdered substance into a wet tank, you get a big clumpy mess that can just sink right down to the bottom and not actually give you a lot of impact on the beer. What do you guys do to kind of make sure that you're getting the most out of these nut ingredients as you're adding them in?
Yeah, sure. So that's that's when you got to recirculate the tank a little bit and really get a good mix going on. So sometimes we'll start like a recirculation process before we add the ingredients, and then slowly add them so it does get mixed up. It makes a huge
Just
difference,
pumping out of the tank and back into the tank. So you're not necessarily
Uh-huh.
dosing in an external tank then.
Exactly. Yeah. So we recirculate in the same tank, whether it's cacao nibs
Yeah.
or nuts. We want the beer to mix well with them.
That sounds like it's got to be murder on your pumps from time to time.
Generally, the nuts and the cacao nibs and everything are in sacks.
Okay.
So it's more or less the beer, going over the
I
adjuncts
gotcha.
rather than mixing everything through the pump.
Okay.
But yeah, that would be murder on the pump.
No, and some folks do it, and some folks definitely are doing that with hops these days, especially with pumps that'll shear them as they're moving through. Um,
It makes a difference.
yeah.
It really does.
Um, so how long what might you recirc with bagged ingredients in a tank for some one of these rich pastry
For
styles?
stout, yeah, for stout like these, maybe an hour or two, not long.
Oh yeah, that's not long at all.
But yeah, you want it mixed up, and once it's mixed, it should be pretty good.
Are there some ingredients that you've used that gave you some unexpected results, either positive or negative, or where you've learned that using a specific kind of that ingredient is certainly more interesting or better for what you're trying to achieve than others?
When you're using different cacao nibs, vanilla and coffee, origin is very important,
Yeah,
and the whoever's processing the ingredient, it's clearly pretty important. So like, Sometimes you gotta spend money to make something good. You don't want to use cheap vanilla or cheap coffee because you're not gonna get a good product. Um, but nothing crazy unusual, you
When you
know?
say, cheap is one thing, but there are some also very expensive coffee varieties that may create beers that are weird or
Oh, sure.
unusual. How do you kind of balance that kind of coffee selection process to come up? Because and I think about, like, I've had coffees that taste like everything from berries to bananas to tropical
Hmm.
fruit or to
Yeah.
just that general kind of stereotypical roast ground
Yeah,
coffee
yeah, yeah.
flavor. um when you start thinking about using coffee, how do you dial into specific varieties in order to kind of capture the flavor that you think is going to be interesting and that actually will convey to beer? Because sometimes some of those nuances in coffee flavors that you might pay a lot for as a consumer that's drinking it in a pour over, may not always translate into a finished beer, or may get bowled over by some of the other flavors in there. How do you think about what can make it in and what won't make it in and isn't worth focusing on?
Yeah, so I mean, right now we've almost pretty much have exclusively been using Mostra coffee out of
Yeah.
Escondido, and they have a great selection of coffee. But I'll look at the description of the coffee and kind of look for something that's again going to be in harmony with the other adjuncts that I'm using. If a coffee has some tropical notes, maybe it's good for you know the imperial stout that we're adding pineapple and orange to, you know, and it just amplifies those kind of tropical flavors,
Right.
you know. So yeah, it's all about layering flavors.
Talk to me a little bit about the process of tasting and adjustment, especially when we're starting to talk about adding ingredients. There are plenty of times that you dose a beer with an ingredient and you're add a couple in and, go in and find that it's not exactly what you're hoping it for it to be quite yet. What does that kind of
Hmm.
process of tasting and iteration and look like for you guys? How do you do that on a kind of production scale?
That it's very painful. It's
Yeah.
very, 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 very painful. It sucks when you have a beer in the tank and you know somebody's like, I don't think there's enough vanilla, and then you try it and you're like, you're right, there isn't enough vanilla, and then you either got to make sure you have extra on hand or you gotta order more and just go through the process again. Um, we have an imperial stout in the tank right now. It's one of the ones we release every year, and it needs more of everything. In fact, it needs more chocolate, which we added the other day. Uh, more cinnamon, more chili, um, and yeah, it just kind of it's painful
What does that
sometimes.
evaluation process look like for you guys? I mean, you've got a brewing staff. Do you guys have kind of guided tastings? Do you guys pull samples and then taste between you all? And then when you think about, how do we fix this and how much more does something need? How does that kind of
Yeah,
decision making process, what does that look like?
well, yeah. When we're dosing adjuncts, it'll probably be me, two brewers, and uh, my business partner, and we'll just talk about it. But when we're tasting barrels together, it's like you know three or four brewers. We sit down, we go through every single barrel, we take notes, we talk about everything. We talk about our notes together, and quite often when we taste 16 wooden barrels, there's usually one or two we eliminate before blending.
Yeah. As you're constructing a blend, um, do you build by addition or do you build by subtraction? I think there's a couple of different strategies there that different breweries use, whether it's I like the flavor of this, and this, and let's build a blend from that, or this doesn't meet our expectation, this doesn't meet our expectation, this doesn't, so we pull those out and our blend becomes this. How do you tend to build blends for specific beers?
Yeah, so with imperial stouts, we brew so little that generally we'll take a barrel or two away. But for more like taking from here and over there and that, yeah, blending, we do a lot more with sour beers.
Right.
We have a variety of sour beers, and we actually just took one of our brewers, Alex, and he's kind of our barrel wrangler or our barrel wizard, and he's kind of like the guy behind the sours, and yeah, it's just a lot of tasting. Yeah, just a lot of tasting from every direction and mixing, and it's a long process. It's right now it's just him doing it, but it'd be a lot better if we had more than one person working on barrels. But so far he's doing a great job.
Still a small project, I guess, in your overall production.
Yeah, for sure.
What are some of the crazier and more out there ingredients that you may have worked into some of these dessert or pastry stouts?
We've done an Oreo cookie pastry
All
stout.
right. Veil style, huh?
Yeah, I guess so. And yeah, it was fun going to the BJ's down the street and just filling up carts and carts full of Oreos because they did have the best price after all. And then in that same vein, we did Chips Ahoy Imperial Stout shortly after because we had to. We've used Froot Loops. Froot Loops come through magnificently in an Imperial Stout.
In an Imperial Stout, Froot Loops.
Yeah.
When you say magnificently, what makes them good?
Those fruity flavors, man. Yeah, just follow your nose.
Okay.
No, yeah, it's a tropical dream.
And those Froot Loops, is there, in addition to that kind of fruity flavor and notes, is there some other contribution from the cereal itself? Some of that kind of toasty, weedy, I don't know exactly what Froot Loops are made of, whether that's oats or rice or wheat or barley or whatnot. I mean, I'm going to plead ignorant on that one, but is there some other of that kind of malt note that it might also, kind of produce or contribute?
No, I think the cereal, the actual cereal part of the cereal is kind of lost. It does add a sweetness and a fruitiness, whether that's a real fruit or not.
So if you're adding Froot Loops, which of course also have a bunch of sugar in them, does that spark any secondary re-fermentation, or are you all?
We try to get them in early or towards the end of fermentation, and then let the beer finish it.
Yeah, so that there's some yeast to ferment that out, or as much as it will, because it's still, at that kind of ABV, it can only do so much more.
Yeah, we don't need bottles exploding.
For sure.
That would be bad.
So I love that you
add
your Froot Loops
it's something we
while
think
there's
about.
still some active fermentation happening.
Exactly. Yeah, it's always on the back of our mind.
Yeah. Are there any other ingredients that you found make for some really fun adjuncted imperial stouts?
One of my favorites was this coconut hazelnut imperial stout we did, grazing on the ordinary. The hazelnut itself, I don't remember where we got them from, but the hazelnut had kind of like a coconut vibe going on with itself. So I was like, this is a perfect opportunity to work off that and play up the coconut. So we dumped in a ton of coconut, and we just created this spectacular beer. It was absolutely fantastic. That is something I will rebrew over and over until I die.
If only you can find where you got those hazelnuts. When you
Yeah. I got to check my email.
With those hazelnuts now, obviously that's not coming in a powder like PB2 is.
No.
How do you process that in order to get it to a point where you can get some extraction out of the beer?
We try to have them crush so there's more surface area. We'll let the beer rest on them a little bit longer, and cross our fingers.
And are those toasted also?
Yeah. Those ones are toasted.
I was just looking it up, and that one was we did enjoy drinking that one at Craft Beer and Brewing, and it did score a 96 with our blind review panel. And as I look at what I wrote about it, it seemed incredibly indulgent. And
Yeah.
yet I also felt like there was a quality of sophistication to it that didn't make it, I didn't feel cheap for liking it.
Hmm.
And
Yeah.
so, in terms of building that kind of simultaneously indulgent, but also rich and sophisticated feel, um, I'm interested in how you think about constructing that. It's not that hard to make something that is very sweet, very cloying, and very obvious. And it is more difficult to make something that feels just as decadent, just as indulgent, but also feels more sophisticated. As you all build those kinds of, are there some decisions that you're making along the way that add layers of deeper richness to those beers that add those additional layers?
Well, I guess when we're building a stout recipe, you know, I try to keep the dark roast pretty simple. I'm a big fan of chocolate. I like the chocolate, pale chocolate, dark chocolate, chocolate rye. I'll sometimes use like a midnight wheat or a black prince. But just with the chocolate malts, I feel it's hard to add too much. I mean, that's not true, but I feel like sometimes it's hard for me to add too much. And when I'm just using the chocolate, I you don't really get as much of the complex caramel flavors or the dark fruit flavors, and it's a nice base. And then from there, we do add a little dextrose for some more simple sugars, more alcohol, but then we also balance it out with some maltodextrin, an unfermentable complex carbohydrate. And so we do build body with malto. Um, I, and that's building body without sweetness. And that I prefer that way. I am not a big fan of the overly sweet, lactose heavy imperial stouts. I mean, that can get cloying really quick. But I feel like, you know, the chocolate, the malto, some dextrose, it's a nice base to layer on some flavors that may have some perceived sweetness themselves, you know. Um, but that's how we make an imperial stout.
What does that kind of mash regimen look like? You're not doing 36-hour boils and double mashes a la
No,
Weldworks and
we do
Moxa.
a no, we do a 5 hour
Okay.
boil. That works for us.
Yeah.
Um, and I think on average, you will do like a 34 Plato beer, and it can finish around anywhere from 12 to 16 degrees Plato. But and that gives us a nice like 11-12% beer. That's another thing. We don't go super super heavy on the
Yeah.
alcohol. I don't think we've ever made anything over 13%.
And there's a nice dark character to it, but that doesn't drop too low in tone. It gives you just enough of that kind of dark cacao note without being so austere that you need more sweetness on that kind of top end to balance it out. And so it's almost like you've run it through a little bit of a compressor, to use an audio metaphor, that's just kind of
Sure.
pulled it in a little bit tighter so that it doesn't have to be as top end sweet to balance that kind of big low end kind of growl. Um, but it still has that kind of finely tuned dark chocolate, dark cacao note to it that is incredibly pleasant. Let's talk about some other areas of experimentation and discovery for Finback. It is in across any beer style right now. What has been the most exciting thing for you to have tried and felt was successful and interesting and kind of validated some of your feelings as a brewer and and some of that kind of creative experimentation and
Oh, what one thing in particular is just the use of coconut in any and every style.
Really?
It just, yeah. I mean, I haven't put it in a lager yet, but it's only a matter of time. But it's great in everything. It's great in sours. It's great in imperial stouts. It's great in IPAs. And yeah, it's very enjoyable. And it always comes out a little better than you think it will come out.
Do you find yourself just putting coconut in stuff because you know it's going to help heighten the experience of whatever else is in that thing?
Maybe.
No, I just laugh about it because when I was talking to Brett Coleman Baker of Urban Artifact last year, he was mentioning that their magic secret is that they just put vanilla in it.
Oh yeah, yeah.
And that he's like, hey, well, you want to make a beer taste good, just put vanilla in it. Like, it doesn't matter what it is, and it doesn't even matter that it's that in large of a concentration. He's like, anytime we put fruit in something, we generally will put a little bit of vanilla in it. Sometimes it's sub threshold, sometimes it is such a small amount, but that tiny amount of vanilla can make people perceive the other ingredients in it in so much more of a positive way. And it sounds like you guys might love coconut in that same kind of way.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, maybe I should start microdosing every beer with a little coconut.
There's your Finback signature for the future.
Yeah, exactly. Oh, this is great. Well, what's in it? Secret.
Yeah. Maybe it's Sabro, maybe it's coconut. I don't know.
I'll never tell.
Yeah. Kevin, so what for Finback, what's the end game look like? What's the goal of Finback, and what for you guys, what does success look like? How will you know that you've achieved it? And how do you define it? What's the ultimate end for Finback?
I think it's, staying creative, being creative, letting our brewers be creative, giving our guests a creative experience. Yeah, creativity is so important to us, and just being ourselves and being weird and, trying new things. And we're opening a second tap room in Brooklyn. Just like beautiful design, a small 5-barrel brew house, so it's a little smaller than what we're brewing on now. And I think that brew house is going to give us the option to brew more, strange things, and I think will give us a lot more room to experiment and just hopefully blow people's minds.
And so the creative exploration becomes the end for
Absolutely.
you. Yeah.
Absolutely.
That it's as much about, there's the business piece of it, but it is this process of exploration that ultimately matters.
Yeah, if we can do that and keep people happy, I'll be happy.
All right. Well, that makes sense, and that's a fun end to take. Nearly 2,000 breweries across the U.S., Canada, and Mexico partner with G&D Chillers. Try out Leopold Malts from BSG. Inquire about a free craft brew sample pack from 5 Star Chemicals and Supply. Yakima Valley is your hops source, whether you brew 5 gallons or 5 barrels. ABS Commercial is giving away a Keg Viking keg washer live on December 5th. And subscribe now to Craft Beer and Brewing to support this very podcast. Also, because if you do subscribe now, you'll gain access to our Best in Beer issue, which drops on Friday, October 23rd. Kevin, if people want to learn more about Finback, where do they find you all?
You can find us on Facebook and Instagram at Finback Brewing and Finback Brooklyn.
Cool. Well, Kevin, I've enjoyed talking about fun and creative and boundary-pushing beers with you, and I've enjoyed drinking your beers while we've talked about it. Thanks for joining me on the podcast.
Thank you much. Cheers.
This podcast is brought to you by Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine for those that love to make and drink great beer. Learn more online or subscribe at beerandbrewing.com or find us on social media at Craft Beer Brew.